to be talking about the rest of chapter 5, which is where we left off before spring break. So we'll do a quick review. I will talk briefly about how the course is going to be run going forward, and then we will move along. Hope everybody is well. So a couple of important announcements. So first and foremost, if you read the original course continuity plan that I posted on Blackboard on the 14th, thank you so much for staying on top of things and trying to get organized yourselves. I know you have a lot going on right now. For those of you that have to come back to campus to get your stuff and move out, I wish you the best of luck doing that, and let's all stay healthy. So again, thank you for doing that. If you already went in and read the original continuity plan, I did make a couple of changes and I reposted it today, which is the day that I'm recording this lecture, which is the 22nd of March, Sunday. An important change is that instead of holding my regular office hours as they were scheduled previously from 1 to 3, instead, I'm going to schedule my office hours during our regular lecture time. That way, if you have other classes that you have to attend virtually during my original office hours, now I know that you have my lecture time scheduled, so you can stop in. They'll be held via Zoom, and I will post a video on how to access the Zoom meetings and also where everything is located for that. So from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays, those will be my virtual office hours. So you can come on with a video, ask a question if you want clarification, if you need assistance with the homework and you'd rather speak face-to-face instead of posting to the discussion board. I ask that you use the virtual office hours and also the discussion board as much as possible instead of sending me an individual email. That way all students can benefit and see your questions and see my solutions, because there are 500 of you and one of me, and that'll just take away some of the challenge of moving to this, this new course structure. I did change some of the homework and Learn Smart due dates because, again, I'm covering Chapter 5B now instead of the Thursday before spring break, which was canceled. So take a look at these. You can also look at your Connect accounts and see that those dates have been changed also. Okay, so let's talk about Chapter 5. I know it's been a while. So in Chapter 5, before spring break, I introduced this concept of process costing, and we can compare and contrast process costing with job order costing. And we said in job order costing, we are organizing and tracking our magic 3, direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead to each unique job or product that's being produced. And we do that by creating a unique work in process account for each of those jobs. So if we are manufacturing customer specific products, we're going to use job order costing to organize those costs. If we produce products that are identical and we produce them for long periods of time, we're going to use an organizing tactic called process costing. So instead of each product having its own work in process account, each processing department will now have its own work in process account. And we said a processing department can really be defined very loosely. So it's any place or location within the factory for which you're adding direct materials, you're utilizing direct labor, or you are incurring manufacturing overhead costs. So you might be adding all 3 in a processing department, you might just be adding 1. For our purposes, we're usually adding all 3 in our processing departments. And so our costs move into one processing department, and then, or our units move into a processing department. We're starting the units, we're adding costs to that processing department. And then when we're done with that step, whether it's mixing a batch of cookies or adding all the ingredients for the cookies, then those units move to the next process, and therefore those costs need to be transferred to the next work in process account. And they move from process to process and WIP to WIP until they're finished. So we're moving the costs, we're adding costs, we're moving the costs, we're adding costs until they get into finished goods. And then where do they go from finished goods? What's that? I can't hear you. Say it a little louder. Yes, that's right. When we sell the products, our costs finally move from finished goods to cost of goods sold. So we are trading our asset for now an expense. So all of those costs that were adding up during the period, the cost of producing these products, we're finally expensing when we recognize the, what's that? Yes, the revenue, right? So we're following the matching principle. All right, so what did we talk about before spring break? I realize this is now ages ago. Feel free also to go back and look at the slides from 5A. I pretty much just discussed the majority of it as well. So if I go in and I look at my slides, so we introduced process costing. We're tracking our costs by each processing department. They each get their own unique work in process account. And then the challenge is figuring out what costs, when we finish producing whatever those units are in a processing department, what costs move into the next work in process account, and then what costs remain in ending WIP for that department. We are using the weighted average method. And I'll talk about the weighted average method briefly in a minute. Before spring break, we said that in order to assign costs to those units that we're transferring out and the units in ending WIP, we have to determine a cost per equivalent unit. And in order to compute a cost per equivalent unit, we need to first compute equivalent units of production. And so our equivalent units are the number of units that we're transferring out plus how many whole units are in ending work in process. Now, if you have units in ending work in process, they are still a work in process. You haven't added enough cost or done enough work to them to finish them, right? They are still a work in process. Otherwise, they would be with the units that have been completed and transferred out. So for those units left in ending work in process, we don't want to count them as they are. We want to multiply them by their percentage completed. So if my ending units are 10,000, but I've only added 50% of the cost that it's going to take to complete them, then I'm only going to count them as 5,000 units. And I call those my equivalent units in ending work in process. So my equivalent units of production for each work in process account, and then I break it down into materials versus conversion costs. My conversion costs are direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. When I break it down that way, I'm going to look at, all right, how many units have I transferred out? Plus, those are whole units for that work in process department, plus my equivalent units in ending work in process. Those are my equivalent units of production, which I will then use to calculate a cost of a per equivalent unit, right? So here's number one, calculate my equivalent units of production. This is now big picture. Calculate equivalent units of production. We did that a bunch of times before spring break. In the problems that I'm doing today, and actually I post the solutions in the slides, but I'm gonna post a separate video of me actually doing the problem, so that should be helpful as well. We calculated equivalent units of production before spring break. I'll be doing those within the problems. And then number two, now we calculate the cost per equivalent unit, right? Once we get that equivalent unit calculation. And then once we have our cost per equivalent unit, we can take that cost and multiply it by the units that have been transferred out to show us what cost is moving forward towards finished goods, towards cost of goods sold. And then also we can figure out what's left over now in work in process that will end up being my beginning balance in the next period. All right, so computing my cost per equivalent unit using weighted average. So weighted average method just means we are not taking into account that our beginning work in process units have been started in a previous period. We're not like separating last period's cost with this period's cost. We're just counting it all together every single period. That's all you need to know for that. So we get a bunch of data here, and I realize coming off of spring break with everything that's been happening in the world, whoa, this is a lot of numbers. There's a lot of stuff here. So let's focus on what's really happening. We have our beginning work in process inventory. So we start the period with 300 units. Then during June, we begin production on 6,000 new units. we complete 5,400 units, excuse me, during June. So what does that mean? That means that those units are leaving whatever this processing department is. I think this is assembly. They are leaving this department and they're going to be moving on. And then I have this ending work in process. So at the end of June, I'm still working on 900 units. What about all these percentages and these dollars? Let's talk about those. So my beginning work in process inventory is 40% complete and 20% complete. This right here is superfluous information. Remember, I defined superfluous? That is excess information we do not need when we use the weighted average method. What is important to us is this ending work in process percent completed. But these dollars we need to recognize, right? So at the beginning of June, we have $6,119 that we are using, or that's already sitting there, and that we were used to create or start to build these 300 units. We also had $3,920 in beginning work in process that's attached to these 300 units. During the month of June, we added some additional costs for materials. We added some additional conversion costs. Remember, conversion is direct labor plus overhead. And then at the end of the period, these 900 units were 60% complete with respect to materials, but only 30% complete with respect to conversion costs. So what's that is telling me is that for this particular processing department, they typically add their materials first while they're processing, and then they use labor and overhead and machinery and all that stuff to turn their products into complete units for this processing department, right? So materials are more finished, but we still have to add more. They're not 100% complete. And conversion, we have a ways to go in order to complete these 900 units. All right, so now we're going to be computing our cost per equivalent unit. Again, all of these steps are helping us to determine how much cost are we going to attach to those 5,400 units that have been transferred out during the month of June because we've completed them, and how much cost will be attached to those 900 units that are left in ending work in process. So my cost per equivalent unit calculation, and again, I would do this for each processing department 2 times, once for materials and once for conversion, these same exact steps. So my cost per equivalent unit is equal to any cost that's sitting in beginning work in process inventory plus any cost added during the period, including transferred in costs from a previous processing department. We don't really get into that too much. And we're dividing this whole thing. So our dollars go in the numerator. We're dividing this whole thing by our equivalent units of production. And again, our equivalent units of production, we already learned how to calculate pre-spring break, and we're doing that twice, once for materials, once for conversion. So this is taking all of that data, that was a couple of slides ago, and putting it into these columns. So this is very nice. So materials, we have our beginning work in process cost, 6,119, plus our cost added, again, it's the assembly department, plus cost added to the assembly department during June, 118,000. My total cost, so in my cost per equivalent unit for materials, this will be my numerator. This will be my numerator for my cost per equivalent unit for conversion costs, right? Beginning WIP cost plus cost added during the period. And then I'm going to divide the 124 by my equivalent units of production for materials and by my equivalent units of production for conversion costs. Now, why are these different? Well, they're different because my 900 units in ending inventory were 60% complete with respect to materials, meaning I'm going to count them as more units. They were only 30% complete with respect to conversion. So I'm going to spread these costs over a smaller number of units because I have to add a lot more cost to finish those. And I've also shown you on the next slide, how did they come up with these numbers? So based on the data a couple of slides ago, units completed and transferred out. So this is my calculation for equivalent units of production for materials, direct materials, and for conversion, right? So two separate calculations. 5,400 units were completed and transferred out. That means they're 100% complete with respect to materials for the assembly department. But my 900 ending units were only 60% complete. So I add my completed units with my equivalent units in ending work in process. That's the 5,400, gives me 5,940. My equivalent units for conversion, 5,400 units completed and transferred out, plus equivalent units of ending inventory, 900 times 30% gives me 270. I add the two together. That gives me 5,670 equivalent units. And then, so when I do my calculation, 124,740 divided by the 5,940, $21 per equivalent unit for materials, $15 per equivalent unit for conversion. Okay, so I'm going to leave these separate when I then use them to apply my cost to my units in ending inventory and my units that are completed and transferred out, moving into the next work in process processing department. Here's a calculation. You're really not going to use this very much, but if you're looking for what was my equivalent unit of production for that processing department, I add the two together. But I don't use this $36 to calculate my cost of units in ending work in process. Potentially, I could use it for my units transferred out because it's 5,400 units complete with respect to materials and 5,400 units complete with respect to conversion. So instead of calculating that twice, once for materials and once for conversion, I could use this, but I would rather that you didn't so that you don't get confused as to when to keep them separate and when to add them together. Just keep them separate all the time. Okay. I'm so sad that I can't take a polling question on this and you're not live in front of me and you can't use your iClickers, but here we go, practice question. Now again, all of these practice questions or any of the work that I'm showing you, which I'll show you on the next slide, I'm going to have a separate video where I record how I actually did the work. So please make sure that you watch that. You can also try this on your own first. And then if you're completely lost, and you might be because this is a pretty hefty problem, you would not see a question like this on the exam. And I did have a question about the exam. Will the exam questions be generated by Connect? Will it look like the homework questions that are on Connect? And the answer is no. I am going to set up and create the exams to look like my exam. So it will be very similar to exam 1 with my multiple choice and true false questions. Okay, so let's go right to the question here for DART Incorporation. The cost per equivalent unit for conversion cost for the month is closest to what? So cost per equivalent unit is equal to my beginning work in process cost plus all costs added during the period. And this is just for conversion divided by equivalent units of production. I'm given a lot of information here. Started the month with 18,000 units that were 10% complete. Superfluous. I don't need that 10% in beginning WIP. Conversion cost at beginning work in process was 16.2. I need that for my cost per equivalent unit. I added and I started work on 84,000 units. There were 17,000 units left that were 70%. I need that. And then a total of $836,880 in conversion costs were incurred or added to the department during the month. All right, so let's see. The answer is approximately 8.804. Let's see how I got that. Again, a lot of work here, and I'll show you how I did it on the next video. Cost per equivalent unit for conversion. Oops, sorry. Cost per equivalent unit for conversion. The numerator, beginning work in process dollars plus my costs added during the period divided by equivalent units of production. I have a little star there because I need to calculate that. Right, so then I go down, if you see the next line, my beginning work in process dollars, those were given to me in the problem, 6,200, plus 836,880, also given to me in the problem. So let me move my face here. move my face. So in my numerator, I have 853,080, right? And that's all just taken from the problem, but I need to calculate my equivalent units of production. So skip down to my formula for equivalent units of production. So my equivalent units of production are my completed units plus my equivalent units in ending work in process. I can calculate equivalent units in ending work in process right away because the problem told me there were 17,000 units in ending work in process and they were 70% complete. So I'm not going to count those as whole units to spread my cost over. I'm going to only use 11,900 units. But my completed and transferred out units were not given to me. What was given to me is enough information to use my weird T account method for units. So I have work in process for welding in units, beginning work in process. I had 18,000 units that I was working on already. Then I started production on 84,000 units and I had 17,000 left. So when I do my equation, 18,000 plus 84,000 minus X, so X is my units completed and transferred out, whether they're transferred into finished goods or they're transferred into another work in process processing department. We don't know, but they are transferred out and they're complete for the welding department, equals 17,000. And when I solve for X, I completed and transferred out 85,000. So I go back to my equivalent units of production, 85,000 plus equivalent units in ending work in process, 11,900 equals 96,900. That becomes my denominator up here for my cost per equivalent unit. And then I rounded. So it is approximately $8.804 per equivalent unit. Moving on from here, again, big picture. Yes, lots going on here, but what is the point of what we're doing? We're assigning costs using weighted average. So I'm using the exact same data here for Darden for my practice problem, my next one. And now I'm asking you to use that 8.804. So how much cost should be assigned to units transferred to the next department? And how much cost should be sitting in ending work in process for the welding department? I have these approximations again because I rounded that cost per equivalent unit to 8.804. And I can see here how I did the work. So to calculate, number one, the cost of units transferred to the next department, it's my cost per equivalent unit, 8.804 times my units completed, right? So I'm breaking down my equivalent units of production into the two components, units completed and equivalent units in ending work in process. So the same two numbers that I used in my calculation for cost per equivalent unit in the denominator, I can now use those again when I'm spreading those costs over those units. So approximately $748,340 of costs is moving either to finished goods or the next work in process account. And then number two was looking for my cost in ending work in process. Again, this is just for conversion. So if you were given all of the information for conversion and materials, you'd be doing on an exam, don't worry. Again, cost per equivalent unit, 8.804 times my equivalent units in ending work in process are 11,900, gives me approximately 104,767 and 60 cents. And then what I'm showing down here in my T account, now this looks like a normal T account that a normal person would be using with dollars. I am essentially doing a cost reconciliation report, and we'll talk about cost reconciliation reports. You don't need to make the report. You can just show it in a T account. And what the T account shows is that I have beginning work in process for conversion costs only of $16,200. Then the problem told me I added $636,880 during the period. Now, where did those costs go? Well, they were either transferred out because I completed the units, or they were left in ending work in process, which would become my beginning work in process in the next period. So if I add my beginning plus my cost added, and I compare that to what I transferred out and what's left over, they should be the same. In this case, they're pretty darn close. They're $30 off, and that's really only because I rounded my cost per equivalent unit to $8.804, right? So when I add my beginning WIP plus my cost added, I have $853,000 of cost that I need to account for. What's happening to it? Well, it's being transferred out and it's an ending WIP. And when I add those two together, they're approximately $853,000 as well. So I'm reconciling, they're equaling. If they were really far off, then I probably did something wrong. So reconciliation, bank reconciliation, this process costing reconciliation is really to be able to identify errors that are intentional if they're fraud, or unintentional, they're honest mistakes and you just have to redo the work. Or for a student, if you want to check your work. All right, so here I am now back at the assembly department, which was that example that we were doing earlier. I have ending work in process, my equivalent units, right? 540 for materials, 270 for conversion, because conversion was only 30% complete and materials were 60% complete. I'm multiplying by my cost per equivalent unit. I'm keeping it separate. And so in ending work in process, those 900 units should have $11,340 attached to them for materials and $4,050 attached to them for conversion costs. So here's my total. We didn't do this for Darden. We just looked at conversion. Here's my total cost in ending WIP. And that's important because ending work in process is something that you report on your financial statements. And then I look at my costs of completed and transferred out. And why is this important? Because they move from WIP to WIP to WIP until they're in finished goods, which is reported on my financial statements. And then it's reported in cost of goods sold, so it needs to be accurate. So I have 5,400 units completed and transferred out. Now notice they're the same for materials and conversion because they are 100% complete. Times my cost per equivalent unit, see the 21 stays the same, and times 15 for conversion, and I get 113 and 81. Okay, another practice question. Sorry you're not here to answer it live. The Richmond Corporation uses the weighted average method in its process costing system. Let's go down to the question. We're looking for the total cost assigned to the ending work in process inventory. All right, so this one is, it takes a lot of the legwork out. You don't have to calculate equivalent units of production. You don't have to calculate cost per equivalent unit because they do it for you. You're just looking for a specific step in this big picture. All right, so it says company's ending work in process inventory on August 31st consisted of 18,000 units. They were 100% complete with respect to materials and 60% complete with respect to labor and overhead. Those are my conversion costs. Then I'm given cost per equivalent unit for August for materials, $2.75. For labor and overhead, also known as conversion, $4.25. So how do I calculate my cost of ending work in process? That's the answer, 95.4. All right, so I'm looking for this ending work in process. I know how to calculate my cost of units transferred out, but that's not what they want, and I'm not given that information. I'm just applying my cost per equivalent unit to my ending WIP. So my cost per equivalent unit, I've broken it down into materials and then conversion. And to get my cost of ending work in process, it's my equivalent units in ending WIP, equivalent units. So the 18,000 units that are ending work in process were 100% complete with respect to materials. So I can count them all in my calculation. So 2.75 times 18,000 means in ending WIP, I have $49,500 worth of materials. And you might say, well, if those are 100% complete, why aren't we transferring them out? You're not transferring them out because you haven't finished them, right? You might have added all your materials, right? So in my cookie baking, I might have added all my flour and sugar and eggs and butter and chocolate chips and vanilla to the bowl, right? It's 100% complete with respect to materials, but I haven't done any of the mixing. I haven't scraped down the sides. I haven't added maybe I don't know, utility cost or whatever else I have to do. And so they're not complete and ready to move to the next department. They're just complete for materials. And then I do the same thing for conversion. 18,000 times only 60% complete multiplied by my cost per equivalent unit, right? Because when I computed my cost per equivalent unit, I spread my total cost that was in that work in process department across my equivalent units of production. And what were equivalent units of production? It was my units completed plus my equivalent units in ending work in process. That's what we're using here. So when I apply it, I either need to use my completed and transferred out units or my equivalent units in ending WIP. I get 45.9, I add that to 49.5, and I get 95.4. Preparing a cost reconciliation report using the weighted average method. Again, you don't have to remember how to do this. Just know how to check yourself, right? You can use a T account, my favorite tool ever. So my costs to be accounted for are equal to my beginning work in process inventory plus any cost that I add during the period. So I need to account for 209,790. How do I account for them, right? So if I made a T account, those would show up beginning plus cost added. That should be equal to my ending plus cost transferred out, which I'm showing here. Cost of ending work in process plus cost transferred out, 209,790. So again, don't have to memorize the reconciliation report. It's just a tool for checking yourself. The last thing that I want to mention is operations costing. So in class, and now in virtual class, I've been using some very concrete examples. So for job order costing, I might say a company that would use job order costing would be a custom home builder, right? Because each home is going to be completely unique to the customer's specifications, and therefore they want to be tracking their direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead or manufacturing overhead and putting it in each unique work in process account. And then for process costing, again, I've used very concrete examples. So a paper mill where all they do is make paper, an oil refinery, right? So they are refining oil into gasoline and petroleum and all these other things, right? So they're very, very homogeneous in nature, right? They're exactly the same. But what about products that are produced in batches? So sneakers, right? So let's say, this was one of my examples, let's say Dick's Sporting Goods orders a special sneaker from Nike that they only want to supply in their stores, and they want 10,000 pairs of these sneakers. Well, it's a unique order for that customer, right? No one else is going to have the same cheetah print, rhinestone, fur, leather sneaker. So it's unique, but they're going to be producing a lot of them over a period of time. You can't just pop out 10,000 sneakers. So they're going to be going through these processing departments, right? We call that operations costing. It's a hybrid between job order costing and process costing. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for you, we won't have time to get into how to organize those costs, but just know it's not always only process costing or only job order costing. In fact, most of the products that we see and use and touch and feel, for the most part, except for like toilet paper, which they're running out of right now, are using some sort of a hybrid method for costing. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for joining. And I will also be posting the Chapter 5B problem work to show you how to do these practice problems. See you next time. See you in office hours.